Thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you very much for coming. Let me start by saluting you, Vermonters. It is a treat for many of us to be able to come and meet you on the first Wednesdays of every month. I don't know of any other state that has such a lecture series. It seems to me to be a bright, shining idea that many others should emulate, creating community by bringing people to speak about an assortment of topics and engaging everybody on this variety by making them feel at home and bringing people from the outside. It is extraordinary, and I am very proud to be speaking here today to you, as I have done in several other sites of the state. I am also delighted because we are celebrating a birthday, and that is the birthday of a novel. This is the 400th anniversary of Don Quixote this year. It was published originally in 1605, and not very often do we spend time thinking about the birthday of a book. We talk about the birthday of an author, we talk about major historical figures, but seldom do we think that a book has the biological arc that human beings have as well, that it has a birth, that it has a development, and that maybe can also have a death, a moment in which it disappears. Maybe the way to connect this idea of a birth, a development, and ultimately some sort of a continuous shape is by establishing the difference between a bestseller and a classic. And I will want to be talking to you tonight, about the role of classics in our lives, and the one classic that is celebrating its birthday and that has transformed my life, my own personal odyssey, in dramatic ways. I will try to interweave the way this book has been opened by me at different moments, and it has told me things that I was looking for. It has told me things that were surprising and unexpected, and in that way it has become a lifelong companion. Let me start with a definition of a classic. I will be offering several definitions throughout my talk, and I will do so by invoking the great Mark Twain, who said, among many wonderful things, that a classic is a book that everybody knows, but nobody reads. Probably there's no better example of that type of classic than Don Quixote. You can ask people who have never really opened the book, what is this book about? And most everybody will be able to tell you at least something minimal. It is about a thin knight that goes out in the world, or the friendship between this knight, who happens to be called Don Quixote, with a chubby, shorter man called Sancho Panza. Or about the passionate love affair that this tall knight has with an imaginary character called Dulcinea del Toboso. Maybe some other people will also be able to tell you that Don Quixote is not really the name of the character, that Dulcinea del Toboso is neither, that each of them have created a new identity, that the knight was originally a man called Alonso Quijano, and that she was Aldonza Lorenzo, and that in that transformation, the juice of the book, the beauty of it, is to be found. Maybe some people are going to tell you too that they started the book but failed to finish it. I can't count the amount of those that have come to me because they know of my connection with the book and have told me, wonderful first sentence, wonderful first chapter, but I know it has 160, 200 chapters. I didn't go beyond the second or the third. It seemed to me repetitive. It seemed to me to be episodic. I can watch the movie, or somebody else will tell me what this book is about. So maybe another definition of a classic is a book that people know without really knowing, that people become acquainted with it as a result of maybe osmosis, maybe some sort of cultural linkage that we have as a result of these generations that have accumulated readings, accumulated interpretations on this particular book. Let me give you one or two more definitions of a classic. One is a classic is a book that is not read, it's reread. It's the type of book that you encounter the first time, it surrenders to you in one way or another, and then you realize that there's a lot in it that you didn't quite get, or that you have to be older to get, older to appreciate, that you have to wait, and then eventually you get back to this book, and the book opens itself up again to you, and you realize it's very different from the one you originally read. And you not only reread it a second time, but probably you will reread it a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time, because those type of books are the ones that are not like bestsellers. They are perennial books. They are constant books. And in that sense, maybe I could even call them friend books, or friendship books, or companion books. That is, books that either we choose because we found something in them, or, and this is my opinion, books that choose us. I have the impression that the difference between a regular book and a classic is that the classic has the patience to wait until the reader that that book is looking for comes back and reads it all the way through and becomes a lifelong supporter, a devotee. I am thrilled to be able to say that I have 5 or 6 books that in different editions, sometimes I've lost those editions, sometimes I've simply stopped at the library or a bookstore and thought that the new cover of this new edition, I needed to buy it, or somebody gave me the book again because they thought I have spoken about it so often, maybe this new translation or new interpretation of the book with illustrations, a book that becomes a partner, a book that becomes a lifelong traveler together with us. Another definition of a classic, because of that, is that book that creates a community. In the sense that once you know that you are in love with Pride and Prejudice, or Crime and Punishment, or Madame Bovary, you have something that connects you with other people that also like that book. And then you end up in book clubs, or you end up simply exchanging letters, or in a class, or in a discussion, or you go to see a movie, because that book will connect you with others that share that type of DNA, the same type of a passion that connected you with it. Finally, I think that a classic is also a book that is read not horizontally, that is not only by our contemporaries, but a book that is read across time, and on which our eyes converge, knowing that others before us have also landed on those pages, that there are predecessors that have opened that book and have discovered some marvels. And maybe their interpretation is very different from ours, because every reader at every time has a different approach to that book. And also that after we're here, others will come to those same pages and will be our partners, even though we will no longer be here, because that book will create a sense of community back and forth in time, and not only in the present tense. Now, I love this idea, literature that is not only for the instant, for the immediate, but literature that has the capacity to survive. That what we're reading are not limited truths, but universal truths, truths that come before us and truths that are going to survive us. Don Quixote is one of such books for me. I can tell you the first time I read it, I hated it. It was coming to at the end of my teens. I had heard so much about Don Quixote. I was born and raised in Mexico. And you can't be born and raised in the Spanish language the way you can't be born and raised in the English language without stopping at some point early on if your life is going to be connected with books, in English with Shakespeare and in Spanish with Cervantes. It's a must, it's a stop. And of course, a classic is also the book that the previous generation hammers the younger one over the head time and time again. The teacher, the parent, the adult saying, you gotta read this, you gotta read this. And so the first thing you do, of course, is you rebel. This is not for me. Why do they like this book? It is so unmodern, so uninteresting. That's exactly what happened to me. I realized when I opened the book first, maybe when I was 18, 19 in Mexico, that it was clumsy, that it was poorly written, and that it was made of a series of sections, chunks, episodes that I could easily replace, put like in a chessboard, replace one with the other, and that nothing would really change. It seemed to me it wasn't really a novel that people were describing, a novel meaning it has some sort of a narrative that leads somewhere with suspense, with denouement. But instead, it was the author, I remember, kind of sat and was on automatic, just adding another chapter and another chapter. Why? And I remember throwing away my first copy. Well, that obviously didn't stop me from coming back, because a good book, a classic, waits for its reader to come to reopen it. But before I reopened it, I started to think about what a classic is. And it has taken me all this time, 30, 40 years later, to tell you that there's yet another definition for a classic. A classic is a book with mistakes. It is clumsy. It is episodic, and it is poorly written. I have reread it almost annually in the last 20 years. I teach it, I spread the gospel of Don Quixote everywhere I go, and I am convinced that it is a masterpiece in spite of its limitations. And maybe a classic is a book whose imperfections are perfected by the passing of time. It is not that they are forgotten. It is not that they disappear. It is that they don't matter that much. They are there, and they are wonderful books precisely because they are as imperfect as we are as readers. And we find those imperfections as doors, as ways in to engage with them. I will be telling you about some of the mistakes and the kind of forgetfulness that the narrator and the author evidence in the book. Let me give you some basic information about Don Quixote. Don Quixote was written by a man called Miguel de Cervantes, you've heard the name before, who was a second-rate author in the Renaissance in Spain, who had tried his luck in poetry and didn't go very far. He had written plays that were not considered very good, and he was also a man that was interested in big debates about literature. We know that he had conversations, public conversations, with other important figures of his time, and that often he was at the losing end of those conversations. We know, in other words, that he wasn't a star. He wasn't the writer that most people thought he was going to survive. Yet another interesting thing about a classic. A classic is not always a book that is appreciated in its time. It can be a book that people thought, maybe, and then they put it aside, and time brought it back for whatever reason. He was also a soldier, and he fought in the great battle of Lepanto, one of the greatest battles of Spain at the end of the 16th century, and he was a tax collector, a lousy tax collector. We know that because it is a fact, even though we have very limited information about Cervantes, that he ended up in jail. We want to believe, those of us who are passionate about the book as a banner against censorship and in favor of liberty, we want to believe that he ended in prison because of the book he wrote. And if you go and see Man of La Mancha, which is the musical, that serves as the entry door to many, many people when they start thinking about Don Quixote. You have the impression that that is why he is in jail, because his ideas have been dangerous, and the Inquisition, the Holy Office of the Spanish Inquisition, has put him in the dungeon where the character of Alonso Quijano transforms himself into Don Quixote, and he becomes a bastion of change, of progress, of transformation. That is Broadway. That is Hollywood. Maybe that is wishful thinking too. The fact is, he ended up in jail because he mismanaged money, and at one point when he left jail, he petitioned the Queen of Spain to be transferred to Mexico. Because at that time, going to the New World was a way to start a new life. People would not know you. People would, you would be able to start from scratch. The Queen or her entourage said no, and as a result, we have this book. He started writing something that he had already done in other occasions. He was the first writer to write short novellas, novels that are longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. He left us several of them. And we have the impression, some of those who are literary detectives, again, we don't have any manuscripts, we don't have any notes on how he wished to write this book, we don't have any correspondence, so we don't have any real sense of how he built it. But we know that as he started writing, he probably had the impression that this was going to be a book of maybe 4 or 5 chapters. Again, it has more than 200. We know that because in the very first section of the book, Alonso Quijano appears alone, he transforms himself into Don Quixote de la Mancha, and only about 3 chapters or 4 chapters later, Sancho Panza comes in. Now, this might simply be something normal and logical, but if you read the book, you realize that the character is so lonely in his madness that the narrator and the author need something or someone to get his thoughts out. And that is the friend that is going to be hired by the knight in order to have a series of dialogues. And the truth is, this book is nothing but a series of dialogues between this slim, tall, and idealistic man and this short and bulky married man, Don Quixote and Sancho. They spend the time just schmoozing, talking, conversing with one another. The beauty of the novel, among many, is that Don Quixote talks in a lofty, educated, almost pretentious way, and that Sancho speaks like a laborer from the rural countryside, like somebody from the working class. And you have not only the tension between the idealist, who's looking at the world in a particular way, and the materialist, Sancho, who's looking at it in a very different way, but the way they describe those worlds, the difference between their worlds, is such that their language also manifests that difference. And that is really one of the pleasures of this book. To get to know the character, this is one of the pleasures of a classic. To get to know not only the content of a book, but how does a character behave? And you know, language in a character is behavior. You know that the different characters that Jane Austen or Dostoevsky or Toni Morrison create need to talk differently. They need to have certain cadences. They need to use words differently. That is the way a character is dressed up. And Cervantes does it beautifully. You will open the book next time you can, and in any page, and you can test yourself if you have already gotten acquainted with how these characters work, and you will see that it's uncontestable, unconfusable. Don Quixote always talks in the same way, and Sancho talks in the same way too. However, And maybe Don Quixote, the novel, is nothing but the story of a friendship, the friendship of these two men. It's a friendship that has lasted so long and is so influential that I can't think of Huckleberry Finn without thinking of Don Quixote. Think of the runaway slave and the child and the difference of how they perceive the world at a time when the country is changing dramatically with slavery, and how really nothing happens in that book except the conversation between the two on a raft or off the raft, and it is the worldview of those two that is coming together and becomes an expression of what America is in the middle of the 19th century in the second part. Without Sancho and Don Quixote, there is no Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Arthur Conan Doyle said that he based his detective, Sherlock Holmes, in the character of an idealist who wants to understand the things very rationally, and that he needed the character of Dr. Watson to get the ideas out. Otherwise, it would have been a solipsistic kind of endo-universe. There wouldn't be Abbott and Costello, R2-D2 and C-3PO, the Star Wars, the new chapter coming up very soon. There wouldn't be Ernie and Bert. Many of the, in all those examples that I've given you are confessed tributes by the creators to these two, Don Quixote and Sancho. George Lucas, having read when he was in college the segments of the novel, and thinking when putting together Star Wars that he was going to make some sort of combination between the two. And you can see the two characters, the tall and the short. In fact, if you project it even further, you can't really believe the amount of tributes and homages that Don Quixote has created. Not only Man of La Mancha, there are movies made in Russia, in Poland, in the United States, all over Latin America that are either direct adaptations or that are versions of a version. Orson Welles spent most of his latter career trying to create the cinematic adaptation and failed. There are also different types of theatrical versions. There are ballets, there are paintings, there are stamps, there are comic strips. You can get to Don Quixote in so many different ways. It's unbelievable that this started in literature. In fact, I would suggest that a classic is a book that can actually even help a nation to find its own identity. Certainly it happened with us, with Huckleberry Finn, with The Great Gatsby. We wouldn't be who we are if it weren't for these great classics that keep on being read by every generation, and every generation projects itself in them in a different way. When you arrive in Spain, one of the first things that you see in the airport of Madrid is the silhouettes that Picasso painted of Don Quixote and Sancho. They are in stamps, they are in posters, they are in coffee mugs and t-shirts, in watches. Spain has developed a very advanced way of using these two characters as prototypes, maybe stereotypes, maybe archetypes of what the Spanish character is all about. And what is the Spanish character about? And I would tell you, in Latin America, we too believe we are all quixotic. One of the characteristics of the Spanish character is this dreamlike capacity. Certainly it happens with us in Latin America. We might not be very good at politics, but we're very good at dreaming, and we can produce wonderful works of literature. To me, there are two great works of literature in the Spanish language. So good that I would even suggest that the Spanish language is justified thanks to these two books, that these two books make the language worthy. And one is Don Quixote de la Mancha, written and published 400 years ago, and the other one is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, published in 1967 and very quixotic in many different ways. I will return to this word quixotic in a second. But I was telling you about Spain being inspired, being defined by the book. Every so often, when Spain is in bad economic or political, in a bad economic or political situation, Don Quixote metaphorically comes to the rescue. It happened just about 8 months ago. Spain, going through one of its worst recessions in memory, all of a sudden, I put it in quotes, discovered the bones of Cervantes that had been placed in an unnamed grave for less than 400 centuries and were surprisingly unearthed not too far from El Prado. They passed the test of DNA, and now that section of El Prado, it's about 3 blocks away in central Madrid, is going to be turned into something very similar to the Globe Theatre in London, or to Stratford-upon-Avon, which have become tourist attractions. Thousands and thousands of people come every summer or every year to see the great Shakespeare plays in either his birthplace or at the Globe in London. There was no site for Cervantes until now, until this discovery of the bones. There were so few biographical indicators that they couldn't put a birthplace where people could have some sort of pilgrimage, or a tombstone, or a place where the novel was first written, because when the novel was first written and published, the intellectuals didn't consider it in any way worthy. In fact, it was trashed by reviewers and commentators, and most people thought that it would be a novel that wouldn't survive. Only 1,500 copies were published, and it took 18 years for those 1,500 copies to be sold. It's mind-blowing because it is the most popular book in the world after the Bible. It sells more copies continuously than Harry Potter or the Hunger Games. The Harry Potter and the Hunger Games can be very, very popular within 2 years or 10 years. Don Quixote is a steady bestseller, and let me give you proof of it. There's no other novel in the English language, or any other foreign novel, that has been translated 22 times but Don Quixote. And you will ask, why 22 times? Why translate a novel so much? 400 years, 22 times? That means that sometimes within a century, there are 4, 5 different translations, maybe even 6 translations. It is an incredible amount. It is such an incredible amount that I would say that the English language is richer in Don Quixote than the Spanish language, because we only in Spanish have 1. But in English, you can access the book in 22 ways. Every translation is a new interpretation, is a new reading of the book, is a new way of understanding it. Why so many translations? Well, one reason is financial and economic. Once the book goes into the public domain, publishers just jump on it and they want to make a buck. And so you commission a new translation, no matter how expensive it will be, you pay $10,000, you're going to recover that investment in the long stretch. 2, because it is, you know that it will continue to sell. And you know that a new translation is always needed. Because whereas the original Shakespeare doesn't age, a translation ages. A translation becomes old. And so what is amazing about the 22 translations, and I have become so obsessed, I confess here to you, with Don Quixote that I have read the 22 translations. My wife is going nuts. I have a large collection of Don Quixotes in many languages, and I have many of the 22 translations in different editions. Translators are, the Italians have a very interesting saying, traduttore traditore. Every translator is a traitor. And while without translation, we wouldn't have the book, if you don't know the language, the fact is that every translator tweaks it a little bit. There are basically two ways to translate an old book. One is to bring the book to the present. Like the Bible, you could want to create a translation that is very modern so that young people can enter it. And so you bring the book from the past, say 400 years, and you modernize it. And one of the most recent translations is a very modern one. It uses words like awesome to describe something wonderful, awesome. Nobody in the 19th century would use awesome that way except for a sacred object or a sacred entity. But there's another way to translate a historical book, and that is to bring the present reader to the past, to create a sense that the language is old. So I have a friend who has translated Don Quixote into English. You're going to say he's nuts, but this is a book about being nuts. He has translated the book into English using English words that were available in Cervantes' time and in Shakespeare's time. They were contemporaries. And no word that has entered the English language after the death of Cervantes appears in the book. So you would say it's a stilted book? It's a stilted translation? Well, maybe. You will say that it's taking the reader to the past? No doubt. It's almost as if it would be the way Shakespeare would have read the book. Again, they were contemporaries. Maybe the best translation is the one that is in the middle, the one that brings the text somewhat to the present, but makes you remember that this is not a modern book, that there are all sorts of layers, and that you should get a sense of the past. But that is just the basic element. Translators, and I'm one of them, we have our little tricks. So, for instance, there was a translator in England in the 19th century who didn't like a section of the first chapter. And so he erased it. And for a long time, most readers in English in England didn't know exactly how the brains of the character dry up, which happens in the first chapter, but he decided that that was too graphic, maybe too pre-Hollywood. And so he took it out. Another aspect that happened is that in France, in the beginning of the 18th century, there was a translator that fell in love with the book so much that in the last chapter where Don Quixote, I'm sorry to spoil the ending here for you, this is a 400-year-old book, you better start if you're going to do something. When Don Quixote dies, he decided not to put that chapter because he thought that he would want to write another adventure. And so he did. And for a long time, the French thought that there was yet another adventure, another series of chapters fit into the second part of the book that nobody else in the world had any idea of, only them as a result of this very creative translator. So translators play tricks sometimes, or maybe they are censoring entities. They want to leave their mark. This in a book, my friends, that deals with translation all the time in two ways. Again, I'm hoping that after here, you will go and maybe be inspired and open the book. There's a moment in which, early on in the narrative, the narrator who keeps on playing games with us. Just think of how the first sentence goes. In a place of La Mancha, of which name I don't want to remember. He already has established himself as a very moody narrator who will remember certain things and forget others just for his own benefit. He doesn't tell you which village in particular. He won't tell you a lot of other things. He tells us at one point that this is his story, but then in chapter 8, he says that he happens to have stopped by Toledo, one of the big cities in Spain, and a center for translation at the time. And that The fact is that he found the original of the story of Don Quixote, the Great Knight, on a table of old books that were in scrolls, written in Arabic. And that since he doesn't know any Arabic, he found a young Muslim who hardly spoke Arabic. The word that he uses is un joven aljamiado, meaning like a second or third generation Muslim, to translate quickly for him. And what we're getting is that almost simultaneous translation. This tells you a lot about how there are layers of translation here, but it tells you also something that is absolutely amazing. Awesome. And that is that the greatest classic of Hispanic culture purports to have been written in Arabic. And the Arabs, just like the Jews were expelled from Spain, perceived as unworthy, as second class. For Cervantes or the narrator to say that this book comes originally from the Arabic would be the equivalent for us to say that Leaves of Grass wasn't written by Walt Whitman in English, but was written by a descendant of Pocahontas in a language that Whitman just presented and translated and revised for us. That the source, the very base of our great poetry book is not the English language that we have as our common denominator, but that there's something behind it. There is another aspect of translation that is beautiful. At some point, Don Quixote and Sancho enter a bookstore in Barcelona. And they look at all these books, and Sancho asks Don Quixote, what's the point of reading in translation? Is it good? Is it bad? Should we just read in the original books that we have? And Don Quixote says something that I love. He says, reading a book in translation is like looking at a Flemish tapestry from the back. You know that there are colors there, and you know that there are designs, but you're not getting it. However, he also says, if you don't have access to the original, you need that tapestry. It reminds me of another very beautiful description of what reading in translation is. It was by a Hebrew poet of the early 19th century who said that reading a book in translation is like kissing a bride through a veil. I don't have to. The kiss happens, the bride is there, but somehow the experience is mediated. I say this because 9 out of 10 people in the world read Don Quixote in translation. The majority of the people that go to the book read it in translation, so they are looking at a tapestry, a Flemish tapestry through the back. They are kissing the bride through a veil. But they are also encountering the bride and the Flemish tapestry. And they, as every reader does, ends up finishing the design. I think that's what all of us do with a book. We are the partners in the creation of this book, particularly of a classic. We return to it because we want to see what we have offered to it. Second moment in my life when I opened the book, I was already in my late 20s. I was thinking of becoming a professor and dreaming of becoming a writer in the Spanish language. And I opened it, and I realized that I had been wrong, that I shouldn't have destroyed my first copy. That this book is more than a novel, is a manual for life. There's a lot in there that one finds that tells you how to live life fully. And I found that originally I had thought of the book as dealing with a madman, a man that loses his wits. It was at the beginning of my second reading, and more so today. I'm the age that Alonso Quijano is at the beginning of the book. when after reading and reading and reading, we are told that he loses his mind and he becomes a character just like the many characters that he has been reading, a knight just like those knights. And I realize today that it is not about an idiotic idealist, maybe a fool, maybe a madman. I think it's about a midlife crisis. I think it's a book about a man who doesn't want to give up his dreams, who wants to remain in touch with the person that he was when he was a young man. Why the connection with reading? I have spent a long time of my life reading and dreaming that I could be with these characters myself. And you know, when you see little kids wanting to be Superman or Spider-Man or Batman or Harry Potter, I think that's exactly what happens with Don Quixote. He reads about these great knights and becomes one of them. So maybe this book is also a critique of reading, the effects, the bad effects on reading. So maybe I should be telling you don't read it because you could run the risk of going mad. But I won't say that because I think that it is a critique of reading in the way that we all understand what reading is about. That we need the imaginary worlds as much as we need the real world to exist, because only the real world would be too little. And that is, I guess, what that novel is about. The fact that you can become a dreamer, and you can be 20 or you can be 50, and that dream will keep you going. What a wonderful idea. What an American idea. I now, having become an immigrant, having adopted the US citizenship, I think this is a great American novel. It was written in Spanish 400 years ago. But you know, when signing the Declaration of Independence, George Washington had a copy of it in his house. Hamilton loved this book. The amount of Americans that have identified with this book, Faulkner said that he read this book every year in order to remain alive. Mark Twain quotes it, not only pays tribute to it in Huckleberry Finn, quotes the book in Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer tells Huck that he, in the cave, he wants to be like Don Quixote and Sancho. Nabokov thought that this was the cruelest book ever written, the most violent, and he is right to a certain degree. Toni Morrison has paid tribute to it in a number of her novels as well. This is a book that in many ways connect with the American dream, that you come to a country, and I'm here speaking as an immigrant, you come to a country and you start new, you start a new life. You hold on to your dreams, and at the same time you cease to be one person reading the book, and you become the character of your own narrative. And this is a book also about exceptionalism, about somebody who wants to say, I don't want to be like everybody else in Spain at the beginning of the 17th century. Hidalgos that don't do anything, that are spending their idle time just running behind women. I want to be different. I want to be exceptional. And the book is about a man who goes out and tries to do something that many Americans do: fix the world, improve it, correct the wrongs. Maybe that is why every translation offers a new opportunity. Let me tell you one or two more things about Spain at that time. There were a lot of connections with the United States. Spain at the beginning of the 17th century was a country that was a big empire that had run itself almost to the ground by trying to connect and correct many of the colonies across the Atlantic. 100 years plus after 1492, Spain had colonies that went from Argentina to the American Southwest, and yet people didn't pay taxes, the crown was falling apart, and the military believed that through its presence, it could control the population, both in the colonies and in the very nation. And something very important happened also, and that is that in 1492, Columbus, as you know, discovered or encountered the new reality across the Atlantic without wanting. The Jews were expelled from the peninsula, just as Columbus is for the first time opening the doors to a completely new population of indigenous people that are in the New World. Spain is getting rid of those that it considers to be unlike the true Christians. Jews in 1492 and Muslims at the beginning of the 1500s. The rhetoric at that time was about how immigrants and how immigrants from Africa and how people who were either Muslim or Jews were taking away from Christians what was truly theirs. There was a kind of xenophobic moment in Spain. Not unlike the moment we're living today, where we hear a lot about the latest statement by Donald Trump that Puerto Ricans are the worst Mexicans. It's quite a convoluted thought. Or that the Syrians will come and unravel our society in general. And we are affected at the same time by threats of terror that come from other moments, from other sides, just as Spain was experiencing the rise of the British Empire that would ultimately replace it. And what Cervantes does in this book is register the feelings through people that are different. There are moments where Don Quixote and Sancho find someone who is a Muslim in secret or is a Jew in secret and react to that person. And we can get a sense of the type of society that was, the tensions, the dualities that were existing at the time. Let me wrap this up with one more concept of what a classic is. I think ultimately a classic is a kind of open-ended, infinite book. A book that you think you know what it is about, and then when you return to it, you realize is much more and maybe much less. And that is because the book has changed in your eyes, but you have also changed as a reader when you return to it. And so there is a kind of give and take that goes on all the time through this relationship. And you will find something in it, as I did when I was younger, thinking that it was an idealist, that will change with now thinking it's about a midlife crisis. And I will find that the very mistakes, the very typos, for instance, at one point, the wife of Sancho is described with one name, and then the narrator forgets, and she has another name, and another name, and another name. And it's not that he's a polygamist. It's the same wife, but the narrator has forgotten, and so has the author. We also know at one point that there is a donkey in one place, and it's Sancho's donkey, and then the donkey disappears, and then it shows up out of nowhere in another chapter. And that is because classics at that time didn't have editors. They have authors, but they didn't have editors. And the editors today are the ones that will tell you, correct this, or that will meddle into the book. One great thing about a classic that comes from the past is that almost in all cases, you know that this is the way the author intended it, for better or worse, with all its mistakes. And so, happy birthday, Don Quixote, an open book, a book full of complicated characters, a book about dreams and dreamers, and a book that is so malleable that each of us will find in it something else, something different. Ultimately, a book that has survived 400 years. There's got to be something in it that it's worth our time. Thank you. Some questions? Yeah, maybe there are some complaints or questions or different readings. So it is often said that the novel is, that Don Quixote is the first modern novel. And I have gone as far as to suggest that this is a novel that invented modernity. This actually is the title of this lecture. What does this really mean? It means that unlike previous books, where characters don't have an internal life, in Don Quixote, the changes are occurring at two levels. What Don Quixote and Sancho are experiencing, and you see Spain at the beginning of the 17th century with the inns, the churches, the markets, the people in the river, etc. But you also see the internal life of the character being transformed. It might sound to us as something almost irrelevant, but the great contribution of Don Quixote, I think, is that though you don't have it in the book, there is an internal narrative that is going on that later on we will call stream of consciousness. What is happening in our mind while while you're looking at me, you're thinking whatever you're thinking. And there's a dialogue that you're having with yourself. And that is, you notice in the book that both Sancho and Don Quixote are not only mouthpieces for the author or the narrator, they have an internal life. And I'll give you an example. Whereas in the Bible, when a character talks, it is not a distinct way of talking, say the character of the patriarch Abraham or of Moses. It's not as if they talk in a particular way, or as if their dialogue is a statement of the inner life that they have. And the same thing happens with Homer's The Odyssey, or Dante's The Divine Comedy, or even the Canterbury Tales. The characters are more types, those types, or even stereotypes. Certainly the Canterbury Tales, or the Odyssey, the big voyager, or the Cyclops, or the soldier. Here the characters change. And the novel starts with Don Quixote in one inner truth and ends with Don Quixote with a different truth. He will change. He will come from convincing himself that he is a knight to 200 plus chapters later saying, all right, you guys have been telling me that I am not a knight, that I am a fool. I agree, I'm not a knight. But you know what happens then? Everybody else tells him, no, please, go on being the knight. If you stop being Don Quixote, what are we going to do? Everybody has now fallen into the big fantasy of the character. And so internally they have changed, and they are the product, they have a lot of anxiety. And one of the fixtures of modernity is that individual anxiety that we all have because we don't get the job, because our kids are not doing what we want, because our political candidates are who they are, etc. We have this inner life. Let me conclude this with one more thing. I love this book so much that even though these two characters, the materialist and the idealist, Sancho and Don Quixote, are so different, you will notice as you enter really the book that Don Quixote becomes much more like Sancho, and Sancho becomes much more like Don Quixote. You know, like couples that have been together many years, and ultimately they remained even more who they are, but there's a feature in them that is now borrowed from. So there's a kind of quixotization of Sancho and a Sanchification of Don Quixote. And this brings me to the last point. I can count them with my hand, and I actually can't because I forget most of them. There are many writers whose name has become an adjective. Think of Kafkaesque, or Shakespearean, or Hemingway-esque. But there are very, very, very few characters, not authors, characters whose name has become an adjective. You don't say Hamletian, or Macbethian, or Othelian, but you do say Quixotic. And you don't have to know the novel to say Quixotic. And I think that we all, without reading the book, have elements of the Quixotic. I think that Obama is a very Quixotic, or was much more a Quixotic character. Nelson Mandela, Cesar Chavez, Dr. Kevorkian. Dreamers that persist in their view of things. And now we call them Quixotic. Some of them read the book, some of them didn't, but the novel has donated this word that was first registered at the beginning of the 19th century by the Oxford English Dictionary. Quite a contribution. Thank you.